Hello viewers. Today we will discuss about Work Permit Visa of Canada. We will cover the followings: types of work permits and brief discussion, open work permit in specific situations, eligibility, document navigation, and after-you application. There are two types of work permit in Canada. We will discuss employer-specific work permit and open work permit. Employer-specific work permit. An employer-specific work permit lets you work in Canada according to the conditions on your work permit, such as the name of the specific employer you can work for, how long you can work, the location where you can work, if applicable. Before you apply for an employer-specific work permit, your employer must give you a copy of your employment contract, one of the following: a copy of a Labour Market Impact Assessment, LMIA, an offer of employment number, for LMIA exempt workers. To get this number, your employer must use the employer portal. If your employer does not need to use the employer portal to submit an offer of employment, they must give you a copy of the employment contract. Open work permit. An open work permit lets you work for any employer in Canada, except for one that is listed as ineligible on the list of employers who have failed to comply with the conditions. A link is provided in the description for the employer who is found non-compliant, or regularly offers striptease, erotic dance, escort services, or erotic massages. You can only get an open work permit in specific situations. Some jobs require a medical exam. If you don't want medical conditions on your open work permit, you can get a medical exam from a panel physician. You can only get an open work permit in specific situations. You may be eligible for an open work permit if you are an international student who graduated from a designated learning institution and are eligible for the post-graduation work permit program, are a student who's no longer able to meet the costs of your studies, destitute student, have an employer-specific work permit and are being abused or at risk of being abused in relation to your job in Canada, applied for permanent residence in Canada, are a dependent family member of someone who applied for permanent residence, are the spouse, common law partner, or dependent child of a low or high-skilled worker, are the spouse or common law partner of an international student, are the spouse or common law partner of an applicant of the Atlantic Immigration Pilot Program, are a refugee claimant, protected person or their family member, are under an unenforceable removal order, are a temporary resident permit holder, and are a young worker participating in special programs. Eligibility requirements for all applicants. There are specific requirements you need to meet, depending on where you are when you apply for your work permit. But regardless of where you apply or which type of work permit you apply for, you must prove to an officer that you will leave Canada when your work permit expires. Show that you have enough money to take care of yourself and your family members during your stay in Canada and to return home. Obey the law and have no record of criminal activity. You may be asked to give a police clearance certificate. Not be a danger to Canada's security. Be in good health and have a medical exam, if needed. Not plan to work for an employer listed with the status ineligible on the list of employers who failed to comply with the conditions. Not plan to work for an employer who, on a regular basis, offers striptease, erotic dance, escort services, or erotic massages, and give the officer any other documents they ask for to prove you can enter the country. Extend your visa if you're eligible, for example to continue your studies in the UK. Eligibility requirements if you apply from outside Canada. If your occupation is not on the lists below, your application will be processed. However, it may take longer than it normally would. When you fill out the work permit application form, to get priority processing, follow these steps. 1. Get the National Occupational Classification, NOC, number your employer entered on the Offer of Employment or Labour Market Impact Assessment, LMIA. 2. Enter that number in the job title box. This is box 4 in the Details of Intended Work in Canada section. You must enter only the number. If you apply for a work permit on or after November 16, 2022, make sure you use the NOC 2021 codes. Eligibility requirements if you apply from inside Canada. You can only apply for a work permit from inside Canada if you have a valid study or work permit. Your spouse, common law partner, or parents have a valid study or work permit. You're eligible for a post-graduation work permit and your study permit is still valid. You have a temporary resident permit that is valid for 6 months or more. You're waiting on a decision on an application for permanent residence from inside Canada. You made a claim for refugee protection. You've been recognized as a convention refugee or protected person by the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada. You're allowed to work in Canada without a work permit, but you need a work permit to work in a different job. This does not apply to business visitors, or you're a trader, investor, intracompany transferee, or professional under the Canada, United States, Mexico Agreement, CUSMA. Eligibility requirements if you apply at a port of entry. New rules about where to apply for a PGWP. As of June 21, 2024, you can no longer apply for a PGWP at a port of entry, airport, land, or marine border when entering Canada. To apply at a port of entry, POE, you must meet all of the following. Be from a visa-exempt country. Be eligible for an electronic travel authorization or to travel without a visitor visa. Meet other requirements depending on the type of work permit you're applying for. You cannot apply at a port of entry, POE, if you need a visitor visa, are a citizen of one of the countries on this list, are an International Experience Canada applicant, who is not a citizen or permanent resident of the United States, are applying under the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program, are applying for a post-graduation work permit. After you apply, if you're outside Canada, book your biometrics collection appointment as soon as you can to avoid processing delays. How your application is being processed. Check your application to make sure you have all the necessary documents, including biometrics. If it's incomplete, your application will be returned without processing it. An officer will also check the list of employers who failed to comply with the conditions to make sure that the employer can hire you, and that you qualify for a work permit. You may also be asked to go to an interview with our officials in your country, or send more information or documents. The online application system uses Coordinated Universal Time, UTC. If you are asked to upload documents in your account, you must submit them before midnight UTC on the date the officer gives you. Make sure you know the difference between your local time and UTC. You might need a medical exam to enter Canada. If you do, an officer will tell you and will send you instructions on what to do. A medical exam can add over 3 months to the time it takes us to process your application. There's a new way to check your application status. You can only use the tracker if you're applying for sponsorship of a spouse, partner, or dependent child, or you're being sponsored as one. Express entry. A study permit. A work permit. A visitor visa, temporary resident visa. Create a tracker account only after you received your acknowledgement of receipt letter by mail or email. You can't use your username and password from the Client Application Status tool to access this tracker. You must create a new account. If your work permit application is approved, you'll get an approval letter that says you're allowed to work in Canada. This letter is called the Port of Entry Letter of Introduction. You should bring this letter with you when you travel to Canada and present it at the port of entry. This letter is not your work permit. You'll only get your work permit at the port of entry the day you arrive in Canada. The work permit will outline the type of work you can do, the employer you can work for, where you can work, how long you can work. If you're in Canada, how we process your application. Check your application to make sure you have provided all the necessary documents, including biometrics if required. If it's incomplete, we'll return your application without processing it. An officer will also check the list of employers who failed to comply with the conditions to make sure that the employer can hire you, and that you qualify for a work permit. Depending on the type of work you'll be doing, you might need a medical exam. If you do, an officer will tell you and will send you instructions on what to do. A medical exam can add over 3 months to the time it takes us to process your application. You may also ask to send more information. If you're a visitor who is applying for a work permit in Canada and held a valid work permit in the last 12 months, you can ask to be allowed to work while we process your application. Who's eligible? You must be physically present in Canada when you apply. You must stay in Canada while we process your application. If you leave while your application is being processed, you won't be eligible under this public policy. Be a visitor with valid status when you apply for the work permit. If your visitor status has expired, you'll need to restore your visitor status before you apply for a work permit. Applied for an employer-specific work permit between August 24, 2020 and August 28, 2024. Have held a work permit that was valid in the 12 months before you applied for a new work permit. How to get authorization to work while you wait. Follow these steps. Step 1. Contact. After you apply, fill out the IRCC web form. When you fill out the Your Inquiry section, you must copy the text below. Message to request interim authorization to work. Make sure you fill out the sections in square brackets, including the dates. Work permit number begins with a U. Name of your employer. Title of your job. If you applied on paper and don't know your application number, include your courier tracking number. This will ensure we can find your application. If you have other questions, you need to fill out a new IRCC web form. Step 2. Wait for us to contact you. You must wait for to email you to let you know that you can start working. This may take up to 30 business days, 6 weeks. Your application is approved. If you were eligible to apply for a work permit from within Canada. If you were eligible to apply from within Canada, you filled out the form called Application to Change Conditions, Extend My Stay or Remain in Canada as a Worker, IMM 5710. In that case, you will get the work permit to the Canadian address you gave. This also applies if you're a visitor who applied for a work permit under a temporary public policy. If your mailing address changes before we send you our decision, you must follow the instructions to tell us your new address. The work permit will outline the type of work you can do, the employer you can work for, where you can work, how long you can work. If you followed the instructions to apply for a work permit from outside Canada. In this case, you filled out the form called Application for Work Permit made outside of Canada, IMM 1295. If your application is approved, you'll get an approval letter that says you're allowed to work in Canada. This letter is called the Port of Entry Letter of Introduction. It is not a work permit. You need to leave and return to Canada to get your work permit. When you return, show your letter of introduction at the Port of Entry. The work permit you receive at the Port of Entry will outline the type of work you can do, the employer you can work for, where you can work, how long you can work. When you arrive in Canada, prepare your documents. When you arrive in Canada, you must have your passport, your visitor visa, if you need one, any travel documents you're carrying. You may also need to show proof that your work permit application was approved. One way to do this is to show the Border Services Officer your Port of Entry Letter of Introduction. You'll get this letter if you applied online or gave us an email address in the work permit application form for communicating with you. You can print this letter or bring an electronic version with you. You should also bring supporting documents, such as proof that you meet the requirements of the job, such as proof of work experience and education. A copy of your employer's Positive Labor Market Impact Assessment, LMIA, if required. You'll also need a copy of your attestation of issuance of your Quebec Acceptance Certificate, CAQ, if your employer needed an LMIA and you'll work in Quebec. The offer of employment number, your employer received when they submitted the offer of employment through the employer portal, if you are LMIA exempt and coming to work for a specific employer. Check your identity. When you arrive in Canada, You must have. Check your identity to make sure that you're the same person who was approved to travel to Canada. If you enter Canada at certain Canadian airports, your fingerprints will be checked automatically at a primary inspection kiosk. The system will check your identity against the information collected when your application was submitted. If you enter Canada at smaller airports and all land ports of entry, your fingerprints may be checked if we refer you to a secondary inspection, where a Border Services officer will use a fingerprint verification device to check your fingerprints. Tell the Border Services officer that you have come here to work and show the documents you brought with you. Frequently asked question is coming in our next video. Thank you for watching.